And we are live. Good morning. It is the beginning of a new week, and this is the daily broadcast for Citizen Ed, the EIP broadcast. Thank you guys for joining. Good morning, fam, as I say every morning when we start. Today, we're going to start the week out with Garris Stroud, who is a veteran educator in Kentucky. He's taught science at the middle school level, which in itself, if you teach middle school, congratulations, you have won the Patience Award in all of education. And I always say that. Let me just say why I'm saying that. Middle school is the thing that almost everybody says we get wrong in the United States. Can remember a visit from the Middle School Association years ago, where they kind of laid out what a special animal middle school is, separate from all the rest of education, and how it gets so little attention. There's a lot of early ed and elementary attention, and a lot of high school attention, a lot of early ed before school, and a lot of post-secondary attention. Very little on middle school. So Garris, thank you for doing that, and good morning.
Good morning, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's certainly a unique challenge. I love what I do. I love the middle school setting, but as you've just pointed out, the kids are so diverse in their needs and their interests. We say that sixth graders are babies, seventh graders are aliens, eighth graders are sloths. Like there's so many different needs. And of course, those are generalizations too, right? I mean, we've got eighth graders who are basically like high school kids, and we have sixth graders come up and they're essentially elementary schoolers. And so meeting their needs is really challenging, but it's a lot of fun at the same time.
We should do a whole show on middle school at some point. I will say also for Black students, and particularly Black boys, middle school is where all hell breaks loose in terms of statistics around discipline, suspensions, out of class time, and kind of a separation from the rest of the students in terms of academics. So I think anybody who's really interested in Black boys specifically should look at middle school and just look at the stats and see what happens there. And that kind of rolls into what we're talking about a little bit today. So we're talking about culturally relevant teaching and education. And we're talking about it from the perspective of how educators might feel about it. You wrote a piece about it, and then, no, you published a piece about it, I think from another parent or educator, and then you got some pushback on it. So then you wrote a piece about the pushback that you got. And I was really interested in the fact that the people who pushed back on you weren't some like crazy right-wingers or whatnot. As a matter of fact, I know one of them who's very left, very teacher-centric, very educator-centric, claims to really be a lot about equity, and still he had kind of a snide pushback for you for raising it. Why? What was the nature of the pushback?
Yeah, so the pushback that I received, which, by the way, this was not what I was advocating for, was that culturally relevant teaching, or to use the more formal phrasing, culturally relevant pedagogy, is somehow equivalent to telling students what to think, right? That there's like this indoctrination aspect of culturally relevant teaching. And so it's interesting, if you've studied culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy whatsoever, it has a formal definition. And it literally just tries to get students to think critically for themselves. So I would argue it's the opposite of any kind of indoctrination. But that was the pushback that I received, that culturally relevant pedagogy essentially is like political activism in the classroom. Which is, for full disclosure, not something that I would advocate for.
So what is the difference, though? I mean, why would someone actually even think that it's indoctrination?
So I think when people hear the phrase culturally relevant teaching, I think there may be a tendency to associate it with some of the social justice groups that we've seen. And in some cases, that may be the case. But the definition of culturally relevant teaching, which was, it's basically a disposition, right? It was an academic disposition that was outlined by a researcher, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's pretty famous within the social justice side of education research. That basically says three things, right? A highly effective teacher of diverse students should do these three things: hold high academic expectations for all students, promote cultural competence within their classroom for all students. So it acknowledges, in other words, that every student comes in with their unique cultural capital to the classroom. Education does not happen in a vacuum, and that our students should become more aware of the cultural backgrounds of their fellow students within the course of education. And then also we should activate socio-political awareness. And I think that might be the aspect maybe that gets outlined or that gets confused with outright political activism. But when we're talking about socio-political awareness in the classroom, that's kind of a reframing of critical thinking. Let's teach kids to think critically about social structures and social systems. Think about their community, center education within the context of their community, and let that inform our practice as instructors, as teachers, so that what they're learning is actually relevant to their community and to their lives.
So the pushback on that would be that you are possibly teaching them from a very specific political belief system, right? So like if people are already on a tear about things like social justice warriors, for instance, and they send their kid to your school, they're thinking, okay, I heard everything you just said. What I think is you're going to be indoctrinating our kid with things around like BLM or some very specific way of seeing the government, or even seeing cultures. I just watched something yesterday that was more right of center, and it was about the indoctrination of kids in schools. And it was basically saying that they're being taught to think of themselves as races and as of cultures and not as one America and one united group of people. It was almost as if it was like any movement into the racial discussion is indoctrination. And you're saying that that's really not the case. You're not really telling the kids one way of looking at the world.
No, I mean, I don't think that that's the case. And so when you mention things like Black Lives Matter, those conversations are important, and students should be empowered to have those conversations. I don't think that a teacher leading a classroom discussion and telling students what to think about those would classify as culturally relevant teaching. I think the pedagogues that exist in academia would say that's not culturally relevant teaching. That's just straight up indoctrination. And of course, when we talk about politics, if you're in a classroom and you're making an endorsement of a candidate or of a political ideology, then yeah, that certainly is indoctrination. But no, I think what this tries to do is really center education within the context of the student's community. And it also may be worth pointing out that culturally relevant teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy is something that typically happens in more urban schools anyway, in which communities tend to be more diverse. And there's more of a natural, I think, environment for those conversations to come out. There's not a lot of scholarship on culturally relevant teaching in more rural areas. And yet culturally relevant teaching still happens in those very non-diverse rural areas where we're trying to center education within the context of our students' communities and really getting them out to the community. It can be project-based learning. It can be service-based learning. So there's an entirely other, I think, aspect to that that's not just simply saying, hey, kids, here's what you should believe.
I like the fact that you include in this high academic expectations as part of this. Oftentimes when we talk about culturally relevant anything, or we're thinking about addressing the cultural needs of students in schools, it's often without the lens of outcomes matter. It's often without the lens of, it's more what should we do for kids politically than it is, or not politically, culturally, to affirm their culture. And I believe in culturally affirming learning environments, but I know it's not enough. I know that's not everything if you don't care about having high academic expectations, caring about the outcomes that kids have. Do you think that was missed in some of the pushback that you got, that this really is about strong instruction, and not just strong instruction as I or you devise it? Even in the state of Kentucky, the way that you evaluate teachers, it's part of the evaluation of teachers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's something that I pointed out in my piece, is that, okay, if we're going to push back against culturally relevant or culturally responsive practices, we really have to push back against the whole system of evaluating. Because when you look at the evaluation system that we use, it's called the PGES, Professional Growth Evaluation System for Kentucky Educators. It says in there that we should strive to understand our students' cultural backgrounds, and empower that background and facilitate it within the course of our instruction. Let students see themselves within the curriculum. We need to make sure that there are clear connections to students' cultural backgrounds within the text that we're reading, the arguments that we're having, the kind of things that they're digesting with text and with videos and things like that. And so yeah, that's a very clear part of it too.
Erica Sanzi, who like you, has written for a publication very near and dear to my heart, Education Post. And if you guys don't know, and if you haven't read Education Post and you're watching this, that's number one, that's surprising. And number two, go read it now, Education Post. That's good for you. Erica Sanzi writes, as a mom of 3, I've seen it done well. And by it, I think she means the culturally relevant pedagogy. I've seen it done well, teaching my kids how to open their minds and think critically. And this goes along with what you just said, Garris, is that it's in some ways critical thinking reframed a little bit. She also says, though, I have also seen it implemented poorly where difference of opinion is not welcome. How would you answer a parent who had that as a fear?
Yeah, I think that's a good take. And so, like with most things in education, there's always going to be those that take it and try to scale it and make it something that it's not, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that there are folks out there teaching, and perhaps what they're doing is some sort of political indoctrination under the guise of culturally relevant teaching. But I would push back and say the folks who've devised culturally relevant pedagogy, who really have done this work and have framed the theological or the philosophical underpinnings of what CRP is, they would say, no, that's not what CRP is. And so, yeah, I mean, certainly there are probably folks out there who are doing it completely wrong. They think that what they're doing is good teaching, effective teaching, or culturally relevant. But again, it has a definition, right? And so if it's not meeting that precise definition, it's not culturally relevant. And I think we should just throw that out.
You say that, well, let me just stop for a second and say, what is the difference between what you have seen in educators who take this to heart and really see it as their thing and are really well educated in it and then are implementing it properly, and educators who may not be on that same train with you? They may not be on the same page, but they really are dedicating themselves to being good educators and to teaching kids basically whatever the subject matter is that they're teaching. What's the difference between a teacher? Both teachers really care about high academic outcomes and having high expectations. Teacher A just has really taken to this culturally relevant pedagogy, and teacher B really is just focusing more just on the craft of teaching.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack with that question there. So I think, the ideal culturally relevant teacher is someone who is culturally affirming, but also they have a very strong commitment to their content and to teaching whatever their subject matter is. I was watching a show that you did with Jasmine Lane about a week ago, and she said something that was really profound, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but one of the best anti-racist practices is just to be really, really sound in your pedagogy. And I think that may, more than anything else, be the separator between those who are real about doing the work of culturally relevant pedagogy and those who are just kind of posers, pretenders, whatever you want to call it, who are driving maybe some sort of ideology, but they're not really committed to actually teaching kids how to read or teaching kids to be literate or good writers or what have you.
You probably have seen it. You and I talked just very, very briefly about the show that I did with Jay Wamstead. We have a show, folks, please go see it, because we're going to be doing it bi-weekly, called White Noise. And it's just my opportunity to talk to a white educator who is going through this journey of learning more about how to be a good, I don't know what you call it, ally, or, I don't want to use the trendy words around it, but, he's definitely. What's that?
The woke speak.
The woke speak. Yeah. So, he asked me a question that we cut into a clip and we put it on Twitter. And the question was just basically, would you rather have a teacher who was super, culturally aware and culturally affirming and understood your kid a lot, who wasn't great on pedagogy, or would you rather have a racist teacher that was just great on the pedagogy and was, an effective teacher? The question was something like that. And I chose the latter. I chose the teacher who can teach, whether they're racist or not. And he got a lot of blowback. He got a lot of blowback just for the question itself. And you're talking about Jasmine, who kind of settled that difference a little bit, because Jasmine was basically saying the most culturally relevant you can possibly be is to care about whether or not your subject is being taught and the kids are getting it. Can you see where maybe some of this would look like it's a step away, though, from the main thing, which is just teaching well and not getting lost in what you just called woke speak, maybe even in woke pedagogy.
Yeah, so that question also is a lot to unpack too, right? And I think the way that Jasmine summed it up, I think I agree with her. I agree with her take. The most culturally relevant thing you can do is just be a phenomenal teacher, be very sound in your instructional practices. So what that looks like, I mean, you shouldn't enter into a class every day and it's woke speak 24/7. I mean, that has to be what has to be the crux of your instruction is the content. To me, that's like the most anti-racist thing that you can do is teach a child how to read effectively, to be a good consumer of media, to think critically about what they're surrounding themselves with in this media bubble that we live in this day.
So you, I think, are positing, though, that to be able to do that, you still need to be able to understand culturally relevant pedagogy.
Yeah, I think you do have to have a solid understanding of culturally relevant pedagogy. And let me just also back to the question that Jay asked you. My understanding of teaching is built on relationships, right? Like you have to have really strong, positive relationships with students. And so pedagogy matters, but I think that pedagogy is kind of built on top of those relationships with your kids. And if you've got a teacher, I mean, you use the phrase racist. If you've got a straight up racist teacher, I don't know how they can build the relationships for that pedagogy to be effective. I mean, you still have to encourage the students to learn. You want to motivate them to learn. And if you're just straight up racist or whatever the terminology is there, I don't know how a teacher can do that. So when I heard that question, I wasn't part of the Twitter mob that went and like attacked Jay, but I also had some issues with that question. I didn't really understand how it's a one or the other thing, right? I think it goes together. To be culturally relevant, you also have to be a good teacher. And to be a good teacher, you have to really have this affinity for teaching kids. You got to love the kids that you teach. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be a good teacher.
That raises some tough questions for me, Garris. Just a few. Like one, this is going to be an impossible question to answer. So I'm phrasing it that way ahead of time, but it's a thought exercise, right? Okay. 80 something percent of American teachers are white. A good percentage of those teachers are female, are women. And we're going to start with an assumption about who those teachers are in terms of their journey on race, in terms of where they are in their journey on race. And let's come up with an impossible thing to come up with, an estimate of how many that we think are not racist, like have overcome the long-standing tradition of race, that if we go further down cultural pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogy, we will get to authors who tell you that everybody's racist. That it's like that racism is in the air of the United States, that you breathe it even when you don't know that you're breathing it, right? So there's a lot of unconscious bias that people carry around with them. That's the logical end of this train that we're going down when we talk about culturally relevant pedagogies. You get to authors eventually who are telling you that it's in everything that we breathe and that we have. So what are the chances that you have many non-racist teachers in that 80% of Americans' 3 million teacher workforce?
Yeah. So as far as the number, look, I don't want to speculate on that. Like you said, this is a possible question. I can't speculate on that. What I will say is I agree that all of us as humans have biases. And that's one of the pushes that we see here in Kentucky is for every school district across the state to have things like implicit bias trainings to come to realize what these biases are and how they may play out in terms of our instruction, in terms of discipline. And the real end for that, to me, what this speaks to is the need for more teachers of color, right? I mean, the majority, if you look at the average teacher, who's the average teacher in the United States? It's a white female, right? And there's a growing disconnect.
White, college-educated, middle-class female who did well through the school system herself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and appreciates the school system because of all those things. And some might say that the whole entire education system, when you look at the behavior that it prizes, actually is tilted towards the white girl in the United States. But anyways, so go on. You started where I kind of admitted that it's an impossible question to answer, but it is a question that you could make a pretty good guess at. I guess that's what I'm driving home at. And, you probably wouldn't want to, I don't say this to like disparage an entire group of people, but if you had to, like, if you were doing an equity audit and you had to do kind of like implicit bias training for the entire 3 million teacher workforce, and you had to consider it like a campaign that you really had to do it, you would have to have some idea of what you were dealing with. Like, some guess at what you were going to find in that population so you could address the issues of that population of teachers.
Right. Well, and so to make the conversation a little bit more broad, because like you said, I don't want to disparage any group of people. If the conversation's on implicit bias, we know from the studies, implicit bias is real. I mean, we all have implicit biases. And to think that, that somehow doesn't apply to educators, I think would be mistaken. We all, humankind, has implicit biases. I think the question is, what does the work look like to move beyond those biases and achieve meaningful outcomes for all of our students? And that's why I'm interested in conversations like these, because I know that I'm not perfect. I see in the comments, there are several people saying you have to do the work. And I'm very much interested in doing that work and learning what that work entails so that I can be better for all my students.
Yeah, Kelly Melton, you mentioned the comments. Kelly Melton says, as a teacher in an alternative learning school, I believe totally in CRP, some students are misunderstood and do not relate well to other educators. By using CRP, students understand each other better and teacher-student relationships are better developed. The reason I asked you, though, for this kind of hypothetical about how many teachers that would you assume are non-racist is only because the question that I asked Jay, or the question that Jay asked me, and you said was a problematic question, which is, would you rather have a racist teacher who's really good at teaching versus a really super culturally woke teacher who's not great with the pedagogy or teaching? Your response to that was you didn't really see, and other people said the same thing, how a racist teacher actually could form the adequate relationships. And my point in that is, well, then we're possibly in real trouble because we have a lot of racist teachers, and not racist like, the simplistic definition of racism, where it's like you're out doing like overtly racist things in public and joining overtly racist groups and whatever. No, not that type of racism, but the type of racist that is more subtle in their racist thinking. And if we're going to say that person can't be expected to teach well, we might be in real trouble, because I would guess that the percentage of those teachers who are still, as gently as I can put it, still on their race journey, trying to get there and haven't gotten there yet, still have some things they're working out internally where they haven't quite figured it out yet, but they're in classrooms every day. They're still teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, here's the only thing I know for sure. We all have biases. We all have work to do. It's imperative that we take action against that. So like Kentucky's lieutenant governor is pushing for implicit bias trainings across the state, every school district. I think once that kind of project is up and at scale, we may have a better answer to the kind of question that you're asking. But the implications are true nonetheless. Whether someone is, even if someone's not an overt racist, right? Like in my piece, I pointed out there are these teachers a couple of years ago that worked in a majority Latinx school. And for Halloween, they addressed in traditional Mexican sombreros, like the whole apparel, right? And they built like this wall, like trying to emulate, I guess, Donald Trump's wall. I can't imagine how badly that disparaged any relationships they had in that majority Latinx school, and especially with the parents. I mean, how can you have any semblance of trust in those educators if I'm a Latinx parent in that school and these white teachers have done that? But like you said, I mean, that in itself is a really, really overt form of racism. It may be the case there are a lot of other people, a lot of other educators who have those biases but are not so vocal about them.
I think this is what you're talking about. School teachers who dressed up as Mexicans and a MAGA wall for Halloween have been suspended. I'm always, when bad things happen with police officers and they say they're on paid administrative leave, and things like this happen and it says the teachers are on paid administrative leave, I have to ask myself what people have to do to get fired these days. But this is I'm laughing, but it's horrible. I mean, look at this. Like, what goes into the thought process here? And this is my point around, like, there's somebody somewhere who is trusting to send their kid to this classroom or to these people's classrooms with the same kind of naive trust that we have about teachers all across the country, right? And this is the level of thinking. Now, I don't know if you would say this. I could look at these folks and say they may not have even been considering themselves at all being malicious in any way, shape, or form, right? And where they were coming from. And my point in what I asked you before is just, I don't think that they would be alone in this level of naivete, if we're assuming good intentions, some good intentions in that they really didn't know. I don't know how I can even stretch it that far, because when you're doing the build the wall thing.
But and see, that's the thing for me. I don't understand if you're working in a Latinx school, or even if you're not working in a majority Latinx school. I don't know how you can look at that and not see malicious intent. I mean, like, if you've done any kind of thinking about what you're about to do here at all, you have to know the impact that this is going to have on the trust that you have with those students. So I just don't see that. I don't know.
You don't see how they could have not known.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems pretty obvious that this is incredibly disrespectful. This is straight up racist. And I mean, that's what my piece was about, right? Like, stuff like this, educators have to call out. Everybody needs to call this kind of stuff out. So to say that that is somehow indoctrination, that we should just look at these really prime examples of just a complete lack of respect, I think, for an entire culture, I don't get how that is some kind of political statement to just call that for what that is.
Yeah, one example that I like to point to a lot that is from years ago, but I will never forget it, is this one. The teachers who wear NYPD t-shirts to school despite union warnings. So the unions were even warning them, don't do this. And this was in the midst of New York having some really high profile interactions with Black people, killing Eric Garner, as a matter of fact. And these teachers rallied to support the NYPD and wore these to school. And if you're a Black parent sending your kid to one of these schools at a time when everybody's protesting the Eric Garner thing, these are your teachers. You can see how we have a problem. We have I don't know what to call it, but you can see why you have people of color who send their kids to school every day who have a reasonable suspicion that that they need to be vigilant about whether or not their teachers are racist, and that they just can't take for granted that all of their teachers come to school with the best of intentions all the time. It sounds to me like you're invested in the idea that culturally relevant pedagogy helps us get to the bottom line of helping teachers work through that journey. I call it a journey. Like, you may not be there yet, but at least you're trying. You're trying to get there, and we have to work with you until you do get there. But you have something like this come up in Kentucky, and it's being pushed at a very high level. I don't know Kentucky, but it seems to me that it's immediately going to hit some politics. Like, immediately there's going to be a fight about it. Is what's happening or going to happen in Kentucky, that you think that groups are going to kind of get fossilized in their positions, and it's going to become a political football, and it may not go well?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think anything can happen. We're in such a unique time. Even though this issue certainly is not unique. So I definitely can see that being a possibility. I'm hopeful that what we're seeing around the state is different groups coalescing around this idea. I've seen a number of people from the Kentucky Education Association, so KEA for those in Kentucky, that have come out and supported this. Union leaders, they're not really a union, they're a union affiliate, but it's essentially the same thing. The leaders within that organization coming out and supporting it. Kentucky has a new education commissioner that will take office in mid-September. His name is Jason Glass. And he's been very vocal about the need for anti-racist work in schools. And so I see this as something that he would support. And then, of course, coming all the way up from the top from our governor's office, in particular, our Lieutenant Governor, Jacqueline Coleman, who's driving this. So I feel hopeful about it. Of course, there's always the opportunity for us to, fumble the football here and lose sight of these goals. I saw in the comment earlier, someone had mentioned that if this is a one-time thing, it won't work. And absolutely, that's true. That's true of just about everything we do in education. in terms of reform and improvement, right? I mean, if we really want this to be to create meaningful changes within our schools, it has to be something that we do with fidelity. It cannot just be a one-time thing. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also a skeptic. So I'm waiting to see what will happen with that.
Looking at it, what you guys have going on with this in Kentucky, it doesn't seem like anything that people should have a problem with. Like, you shouldn't have big pushback on it. You mentioned some of the areas that constitute culturally responsive instruction or pedagogy or learning. They have here in Kentucky's government website around culturally relevant or responsive, instruction, a student-centered approach to teaching in which the student's unique cultural strengths are identified and nurtured to promote student achievement and a sense of well-being about the student's cultural place in the world. And I would be hard-pressed to figure out how that could become very political without just totally doing what happens oftentimes, which is mischaracterizing an effort, right? You could mischaracterize some of this. But high expectations, who should be against that? No one, right? Positive relationships with families and communities, who should be against that? Right. Cultural sensitivity. This is where you get to things like Erica's question, though. I think when it comes to cultural sensitivity, are people going to take that to mean for non-white people, or are they going to take that to mean for everybody? Meaning, like, is there going to be a chance that there's going to be some white boy somewhere in a school who makes a pro-Trump comment or makes a conservative comment of some sort, and they're going to be exiled? There's not going to be much sensitivity for them as they are for others. I think that could be where you have some political problem there. Active teaching.
Also, I mean, if I can just jump in and add, if you're a teacher and you have a diverse classroom, like the majority of your students are not white, then when we talk about cultural sensitivity, that also gets into things like the kind of texts that you're reading, the stories you're reading, whatever the case may be, your curriculum should not, center white characters, white figures as the norm in a highly diverse classroom. Students need to be able to see themselves within the curriculum. Mirrors and windows, is a phrase that we use. You need to be able to see yourself. And then also, it's appropriate if you have a very diverse classroom to see other cultures and the values and things like that of those other cultures. So I think when you talk about cultural sensitivity, I think it gets into things like that too. But anyway, go on.
Well, no, let's stick with that for a second. So let's say you don't have a very diverse classroom. Let's say you have a, mostly white classroom and you want to be culturally sensitive. Does that mean that your text and the things that you're going to be talking about and using in the classroom are going to be mostly white? I mean, because that would be culturally sensitive to the actual students that you have. I'm sure in Kentucky, there are lots of places where they're very white school districts and very white schools. So if you were going to be locally sensitive to the cultures of the people that you have that you're serving, does that mean you're going to have mostly all white kind of subject matter in those classes?
A fair question. And yeah, I mean, a majority of Kentucky schools are mostly white. Kentucky's not known for being a super diverse school or super diverse state in terms of our schools. We do have diversity in pockets across the state, but the majority, I mean, I'm in Western Kentucky, so definitely very white population here. But again, I go back to that phrase, mirrors and windows, right? So students need to be able to see themselves within the curriculum. And for me, as a white educator in a pretty rural community, what that means to me is let's show students that if they work hard, they can get ahead. They can move. They don't have to stay here if they don't want to. That people from rural communities can be successful. People, regardless of the way that they talk, because believe it or not, in Kentucky, your accent means a whole lot. A lot of people listen to the way that I talk and don't assume I have the beliefs I hold just because of my Southern twang. It does not define you, right? And so those are the mirrors, right? But also, even in a lily white community or school district in rural Kentucky, Appalachia, what have you, we still have to have those windows because we know that our country is diverse, that our country is diversifying, and we're preparing students for jobs that may not just be right here in their own communities. Because frankly, by the time our students get older and graduate, the kind of jobs that their parents had, they may not exist here. They may have to go to a more diverse area like Louisville, like Nashville, like Lexington. And so it's mirrors and windows. You can't have one without the other.
When I keep asking this question about the teacher who's really focused on their regular strategies, the strategies that they have before they get into something like culturally relevant teaching and strategies. One of the reasons that I kind of get stuck on that a little bit is it seems like teachers have 8 million different rubrics that they need to answer to. Sometimes they have just a rubric for how their performance will be from the state and from their district and from their principal. And then they go to one training, and that training has them come out with things that they need to concentrate on and focus on in their daily work. And then they go to another training that has another set of things. So I'm looking at this thing around culturally relevant teaching strategies with its preconditions, and then its teacher characteristics, and then its teaching strategies. And it just makes me feel like it would be really hard to get good at all these different things and get good at the things that states are calling for, districts are calling for, and your principal is calling for, and to master it all and do it well. Do you have any sympathy for that idea or that point? I mean, you're a teacher, you're an educator, so it's not like I know more than you on whether or not that's the case, but it does feel like teachers feel like they're saddled with many different masters that they have to answer. So when I look at something like this, it feels a little like it makes me a little dizzy to know how you would do this every day.
Yeah, well, for full disclosure, I mean, and this is pretty obvious, I'm no expert of culturally relevant pedagogy. This is not new. This is not something I came up with. I subscribe to the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy, but I also realize that I'm still young. I'm a fifth-year teacher. I'm learning, and every year I want to do better than I did the year before. Now, in terms of what you just showed, I can't see that anymore, actually, but there's this idea of disposition, right? Yeah, thanks. So there's this idea of characteristics and the preconditions that go into the disposition of a culturally relevant teacher. And that's the other aspect that we haven't, I think, really touched on. But it goes back to what you mentioned about the teacher's journey. So in this framework of culturally relevant pedagogy, you've got these three tenets that I mentioned. But culturally relevant pedagogy isn't just a pedagogy. It doesn't just stop there. It also talks about who the teacher is, like as an identity, as a disposition. And so for me, as someone who I hope that I can call myself a burgeoning culturally relevant teacher, this very much is about my journey, overcoming my own biases, being aware of the practices that I may have that institute inequities within my own classroom. It's very much a journey for me. And I think that that's what this document is getting into, and it shows these different preconditions that teachers should have before really considering themselves to be a highly effective culturally relevant teacher.
So, as you're seeing it, this isn't saying that I go to a training and we talk about all of these different things, and then we embed it in some way and we keep coming back to it. And it's expected that in some short amount of time, I'm going to hit some magic point of nirvana, and I'm going to
no, you're not going to be able to read like Robin DiAngelo or like Paulo Freire and then go in the next day and be like, I'm here to take out these achievement gaps. Like, we're here for equity. That's not going to happen. It's a continual process, right? I'm very much in the middle of this. I'm as naive as they come when it comes to stuff like this. But I think teachers who are willing to admit that and work through that, I think that's the first step to getting better.
What has challenged you as a teacher? What has challenged you in what we're talking about right now, the cultural part of teaching?
So a couple of things. One being, like we mentioned earlier, who the average teacher is. So I'm a young male teacher. Majority of teachers in Kentucky and across the country, middle-aged, middle-class, female, white teachers. So I think going into it with my younger approach, like this new wave of thinking when it comes to schools and schooling and that kind of thing, I think that has changed me, because there are still a number of teachers around the country who still use very, I hate to say antiquated practices, but antiquated practices. For example, going through ed school to become a teacher, I was immersed in this new lingo of, against direct instruction. Let's do project-based learning, discovery-based learning, that kind of thing. Majority of teachers that are really, really seasoned, and I would add pretty good in their instructional practice, still rely on those, I guess, tried and true methods of like direct instruction. So that's challenged me to think a little bit about my approach. And so I use kind of an eclectic model in that way. And then I guess just thinking about like where we're going, like where we as a system are going. I think that kind of drives me to think more critically about my role within that and how I'm contributing to that with my instructional practices.
Isis Span, who's an educator, who I know and love, and you guys should seek her out on Facebook or Twitter, says, as a special education mom, I think the culture of children in wheelchairs and with disabilities needs to be represented more in the curriculum as well, which I think is an interesting point. As a Black educator, Isis is saying she can be challenged like anyone else on this cultural point, because there's other invisible children who are not being welcomed culturally into the curriculum, into books, and into the classroom, apparently. So I think that's interesting, to even ask someone like Isis and others, even Black educators, what are you challenged by culturally in the classroom? You mentioned age. You mentioned your relative youth of coming into a profession that has lots of teachers that may age out soon, as a matter of fact, and there may be a wave of retirements at some point, and an influx of younger, newer teachers. Do you think that there's something unique to the younger teacher that they will be bringing into the classroom that will be helpful when it comes to addressing the cultural needs of kids in classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think just anecdotally, from what I know as a young teacher and within my professional learning network, it seems like younger teachers do, by and large, seem to exhibit a more vocal commitment to things like social justice and these movements that we see going around throughout the country. And so whether or not that will translate into meaningful outcomes for students, I don't think I'm quite qualified to say. But I think the fact that they're willing to have those sort of courageous conversations that perhaps have not been had throughout the history of our schools, I think is really interesting and perhaps a place to start.
You said something interesting too. I was going to let it not go here, but I do, because it involves one form of teaching, which is direct instruction.
Yes.
It's the most studied pedagogical intervention. It has the largest amount of research behind it as something that works for poor and minority children and low-income children. The biggest government studies ever that studied a range of educational interventions found that some of them actually depress achievement, some of them make a minimal difference, and direct instruction makes an outsized difference amongst all of the ones that they researched and tested. And in fact, many people of color, especially Black people and older Black educators, really believe in direct instruction specifically for Black children. And it is the number one way in which most teachers don't like to teach.
Yeah.
like they do not like it at all. They're like against it.
And so I was hinting at that, hoping you would ask me that.
Yeah.
Because
oh, really? Well, then
because this totally goes along with, like, I think there's so many clear connections between direct instruction, and really just instructional style and strategy as a whole, to social justice, even perhaps more than just talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. I think like having these conversations do just as much good to support, our goals. So I am, of course, young teacher, went through teacher training, and we somehow never heard about direct instruction. Like, it was one of those things that was just kind of flippantly tossed out there. It was viewed as an antiquated form of teaching. I mean, earlier I referred to it as it's seen as an antiquated form of teaching. All right. But we went at length about project-based learning, the need for personalized learning. And yet when I have gotten into the research myself through organizations like the Research Ed US, they have a great conference and everything, I keep finding the same thing about direct instruction. And so I use an eclectic model. We do project-based learning at times. I actually support direct instruction because of the research that I've seen. And I didn't get that within my teacher training program, which I think is really interesting, right? Because, I mean, all the things you just pointed out, I don't think there has been another instructional strategy that has shown the promise of meaningful gains for students, and particularly those students who are considered gap students, right, than direct instruction. And a lot of times when I've tried to explain or I've discussed projects within my science classroom, for example, parents are kind of like, yeah, like you see them nodding, but they don't really get it. Like, they don't really understand the why. And in many cases, project-based learning is being pushed because that's what evaluators want to see. And that's what's being pushed by companies and organizations. It's coming down from the powers above, right? When we know that may not necessarily be the best way to actually effectively teach kids. So I think that's interesting too. I think that's worth having a conversation about that as well.
I mean, look at it. So this is from Project Follow Through, which was a large government study of all the educational interventions that were in contest with each other, that different experts and scholars were putting forth and that were being used in schools. And if you can look at the impact on basic academic skills, problem solving skills, and self-esteem, this is direct instruction over here. So this is the results of direct instruction. Its impact on basic academic skills, as you can see here, and on the biggest result is in problem solving skills. And then it even increases self-esteem, better than some of the other educational interventions that were really meant to increase self-esteem, which is really interesting to me. Like, by focusing directly on self-esteem, you actually depressed it in a way that didn't happen with direct instruction. So I think what's important about that is you get into a cultural contest about this is a way that the mostly white teaching force of America does not like teaching, because they believe that it's overly scriptive. It ties the hands of the educator. It actually is a very, I think, it's called direct instruction. It's really kind of more straight up the line than things like project-based learning and kind of child-led classrooms, or some of the more popular things with probably wealthier, whiter parents, things around like, let the child just explore and dance around the classroom and, kind of just have at it type of thing. And
I think that may work if, like you said, the student comes from a wealthy family and they've had this de facto exposure to a lot of content knowledge because they've had the wealth to do so, right? But I think maybe one of the reasons why direct instruction is effective is simply because it's about content exposure. And students often who come from low-income backgrounds, they don't necessarily have the same content exposure as wealthier kids whose parents can't afford to do things like travel and take them to museums and things like that. So when you would ask them to like discover and explore, they have this wealth of content knowledge like in the back of their brain from which to pull that other students don't necessarily have. And so I think that actually could contribute to some inequities in that way. Whereas if you're directly teaching, like you think about teachers in movies when they're just explaining, they're doing the explicit teaching, like that's direct instruction, little d, little I, direct instruction, right? That's putting that content at the forefront of students' minds that maybe they've never interacted with that before.
Michelle Johnson, who is somebody who watches the show daily and has a lot to say about, the training of teachers, says, Chris, you were talking about programmatic scripted direct instruction. Think about Success Academy and the Success Academy Success. They use a combination of direct instruction, as you just said, with a little d and a little I, and project-based learning, et cetera. So it's kind of like an eclectic model that incorporates both. But she says teachers who are content poor will always fail at project-based learning. Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to demonstrate skills related to content that you don't know. Like you can't do a project on something you've never formally studied or learned. So your skill is important. And I think project-based learning and things like that can help facilitate those skills, but you have to have that content knowledge. Otherwise, you're not going to have any skills to practice.
As somebody who's not deeply versed in this, and you're on the journey of learning about it, and you are an educator and you have direct experience in all of these things, I'm asking as a layperson, as a parent, as an activist, as an outsider in some of this, because I don't sit through training and PD on these things. I wasn't part of a teacher prep program where this was or wasn't, taught. It feels like as I'm listening to some of this, that there's a lot about how we address the culture of the children but how much of that is the self-work of the teacher internally to be looking for pedagogical practices that are specific to their cultural population? Maybe direct instruction is better if I have a classroom full of Black kids and brown kids. Maybe it's not if I have a classroom full of wealthier white kids. Maybe it is even better if I'm in rural Kentucky. But what's the work of the teacher, not to just think about what we do to really help the kid, but how we ourselves are educating, not we, but if you're the educator, how you're educating yourself on the best pedagogical practices?
Great question. This is somewhat foreign for me to think about because as a teacher myself, I want to be the very best at my craft that I can possibly be. I understand that what I was taught in teacher training school may not actually align with what the research really says and what might actually be best for my kids. And I also understand that what might work for my students may not work for another teacher's students in another context. And it would be wrong for me to say like, hey, you should do this prescriptive method when that may not work within that context. So here's what I'll say. Professional development across the country, right? It's not like the fault of any one school district. I think needs to change because it's. I'm going to make this side point too. I think this is interesting. We're told time and time again, don't just lecture, don't do the direct instruction, and then you go to a PD, and what is it? It's a lecture, right?
It's a lecture. Yeah.
And we're told all the time, you got to give students choice. You have to make them feel empowered. You have to give them options, go with their interests. And then by and large, again, not the fault of any one school district. This is a nationwide problem in schools. What happens in PD? Welcome to PD. We're talking about this specific thing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, involvement with professional organizations is critically important. So I taught science. We have a great science association here in Kentucky, KSTA, which is a part of the NSTA. And when you go to conferences like that are very deeply ingrained in a teacher's content knowledge and how to teach that content knowledge, you have a better palette, I think, of PD options to choose from. I think that's one thing every school district across America should look at, is offering different professional learning opportunities for for teachers that might play into their unique needs, because every teacher is different. They all have unique strengths and unique areas for development. And so we should work to facilitate those and celebrate their unique strengths. And I think that would be one step towards fixing it, right?
ISIS Span says they taught me absolutely nothing about building relationships with parents and students in college, when it is the absolute key to student success. You mentioned that you didn't necessarily find all of this in your teacher training. This comes up over and over again, and it feels like there's a great deal of remediation that needs to take place on the job. Like, you didn't learn this in your program that you paid money for, by the way. Yeah. You didn't learn it there, so we're gonna have to teach it to you in the schools. To me, which just seems like a ridiculous thing for schools to have to pay for. But even when they do it, you say that the PD is actually not the best. What do we do about improving PD? It's one of the questions that's always on my mind. I ask Jay about this. I ask others about this all the time. Where's the educator voice in making PD better?
Well, I think like within the question, I think you kind of answered it. Too often the educator voice is missing, right? So not everything about our schools is working. And some of that can be attributed to instructional quality, but also across Kentucky, there are amazing teachers. There are fantastic, very sound arbiters of pedagogical instruction. And so why not let them take ownership of the PD process, right? Like, let's expand teacher voice within the PD process so that we can learn alongside those that have been, I hate to use the phrase, in the trenches, who have done this work, right? And learn from their successes, because a lot of times we'll find that a teacher who's really, really effective is not just effective because of their knowledge of instructional practices. It's also within that particular context. So why not connect with those teachers who are really good and find out what they do within that school, within that community, to have really, really wonderful professional learning experiences. And that hints at what you mentioned earlier too, which is, with the comment earlier, which is this relationship with parents and with students, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about our schools as a system, we're built to serve students and parents. And I think that gets lost in the shuffle, right? Because so many of these conversations are teacher centric. And I'm guilty of that as a teacher. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're built to serve parents. And so how building relationships with parents hasn't been more of a priority in these conversations, I'm not sure, but we desperately need to make it a centerpiece.
Feels like there could be a role for students and parents to play in PD itself. I mean, it could be a joint project.
I mean, I don't know of any models that are doing that, but I feel that if there are any innovative models that are including student voice and parent voice within the PD process, I would love to see what that looks like and how that works, and how we could do that at scale.
Yeah, I haven't seen any models that do it. It just feels like what we have seen that is eternal is the complaints about PD are almost universal amongst educators. I haven't met a single educator in 10, 15 years of talking to educators that said to me, no, our PD is great. I actually just haven't heard that yet. I'm waiting to hear it. But what I have heard is we have to do school as a community. We have to there has to be students, parents, and teachers working as like a three-legged stool to make achievement really happen. So if you're going to do PD, it just seems like you might start thinking through about that three-legged stool as a part of your model. Listen, I know we're going to wrap soon. I have a final question that gets us back to the beginning of this, which is, the question was, is culturally relevant pedagogy simply indoctrination? And that question only comes out of the fact that you wrote something about this and there was some pushback on it. And I don't think that people really went all in on you. It wasn't like an epic battle. So I don't want to make more of it than it actually is. But is there room in your mind for the conservative-minded teacher, the teacher with conservative politics, who is dedicated to his or her job, who really isn't going to buy into all of this, not for malicious reasons, but they just see it as a way of thinking and a way of life that is not within their worldview and their thought tradition, and it's not through any malice, and they are going to teach? Is there room in this for that teacher?
So again, I'll just say, when I talk about culturally relevant teaching, in my mind, that's something that's not political, right? I think if you're engaging in a type of teaching that affirms the lives of your students, that is just being decent. That's not a liberal thing. That's not a progressive. It's not a conservative. It's not donkeys or elephants, right? It's simply about doing what's best for kids. It's about centering the cultures of your students, the community of the students within the context of your education. So yeah, there's room for all types of folks across the political spectrum. Now, for those voices that are more on the extreme, that are saying that this kind of thing is indoctrination, perhaps if that's the way you're doing it, I mean, if you're standing up and you're pledging allegiance to a specific candidate, then yeah, that's indoctrination. It's also not culturally relevant teaching. So, anybody who's down for this work, I think, as an educator, of promoting what I think is best for our students, who truly is passionate about expanding opportunities and really wants to see better outcomes for all of our kids in a culturally affirming way, to me, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle that you're on. There's room for all types of folks.
Sounds like, and this is a good place to end, it sounds like there needs to be an education process about what this actually is, what culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive instruction, or whatever you want to call it, actually is. And I think what happens in the public, when these debates are held in the public, they become easily simplified in ways that are wrong and damage the public understanding of what's even being talked about. So I really hope that your Kentucky leaders and educators and the statewide union and others really go on an offensive about educating the public. I mean, these are people that want to be educators, right? So educate the public, start where the public is, because I actually believe that it'll be an easy target to make the public dumber about. That's the best way I can put it. It'll be an easy target for talk radio and others to say, can you believe what they're doing now? And the way that you describe it to me sounds pretty reasonable. It's like just about good teaching. It's about centering your students and the kids in your classroom. So I hope there's an effort to really make sure that the public knows what's being talked about and that the jargon is removed from that discussion.
Absolutely. What tends to happen, I think, with a lot of these conversations is you have voices on the extremes of either ends that kind of overtake and hijack that conversation and really shift it radically and change the goalposts of what the original person was talking about to something completely different. Culture relevant pedagogy to me is simply good teaching. It's incredibly reasonable. I say it's necessary for the well-being of our students.
Garris, I thank you so much for coming on today. Hopefully you'll come back again when we have something hot to talk about. And I'm going to press you next time to be more provocative. Like Jay, I'm going to push you on some things and make you say some things about people that'll get you in trouble. Just like Jay. No, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to make you do that. But for folks listening and watching, you find Garris on Twitter. Garris is a Kentucky Educator, Teacher of the Year, science educator for middle school students, and someone who writes at KentuckySchoolTalk.org. I think that's right. Is that right, Garris?
Yeah, that's right.
Kentucky School, and also has written for Education Post, a very fine American publication that you all should subscribe to. You can find Garris on Twitter at Garris Stroud. That's Stroud. Again, that's at Garris Stroud on Twitter. So find him, check him out, follow him, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks to everybody watching today. Have a great week, and we'll see you tomorrow with another great guest. Thank you all.